I'm Richard Louie in for Alex Witt. A colleague here, David Gura, picks it up from here. Hey, David.
Hey, Richard. Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. I'm David Gura at MSNBC headquarters in New York. Still waiting. Many of the migrant children separated from their parents because of the White House's tough immigration policy remain apart 4 days after President Trump ordered families to be reunited. The resistance, more protests and rallies along the U.S.-Mexico border with celebrities now calling for compassion for migrants. And justice for all, President Trump suggesting migrants be deported without due process, ignoring the U.S. legal system. President Trump suggesting a short time ago the rule of law does not matter when it comes to migrants coming to America. He's using provocative language today like invade, resist, and mockery on Twitter to prove his point. This as emotions build along our southern border with Mexico, protests popping up for a second straight day across multiple states, celebrities joining those voices and pushing back against the administration and demanding changes from Congress. All of this happening as President Trump is golfing today once again at his private club in Virginia. Let's get facts from the ground now in Texas. NBC's Gabe Gutierrez is by a detention facility in Los Fresnos. Cal Perry in Tornillo, Texas, near a so-called tent city. And Cal, let me start with you. You've been near those protests today. What stood out to you from what you've heard from the speakers and those who have come to Tornillo to protest these policies?
Yeah, you know, there was a real sense of solidarity with the kids who are inside this camp behind me. As you mentioned, some celebrities were out here, and we heard, you know, pledges that people were going to fast, for example, in solidarity with the kids inside me, but also a lot of talk just about the next election, a lot of talk about voting registration, a lot of talk about getting people motivated to come out and vote against the Trump administration policies. We've seen a steady stream of people trying to get into this camp. Few have had success. Certainly, none of the protesters were able to get close to the compound. But it was something that is going to raise sort of attention, which is what people here, certainly locally, are looking for, David.
Gabe Gutierrez, let me turn to you now. We've been focused on these numbers that have been provided to us by the Department of Homeland Security on the number of children who are still in government custody. The Department of Homeland Security saying in a statement that they do know with certainty where each and every child is in this country. Help us with the context there. I gather this demands a grain of salt. Tell us how big a grain we need.
Well, David, yes, DHS says that it does know where all these children are and is insisting that it is doing everything it can to bring them together. However, the parents, the detained parents, do not know where all these children are. We've been speaking with immigration attorneys, immigration activists who say that it is still a jumbled mess to try to figure out where a lot of these children are. So to give you an idea of where I am, this is the Los Fresnos, Texas detention facility, the Port Isabel detention facility, one of the largest in the area where many of the parents are here. And we're told by some immigration attorneys that there are reunions happening at this facility. But just a few days ago, we'd spoken with 4 mothers here. All of them were in a state of confusion. 2 of them had no idea where their children were. Two others did know. One of them had learned through family members that that child was in New York State. The other one was in Michigan. We are also speaking with mothers who are detained that fear that they could be deported even before they find out where their child is. There's one out in El Paso who knows that her child is in a detention center in Arizona. The grandmother in Honduras is desperate to find out information. So despite the government saying that this is an orderly process that is happening over the last couple of days, there are still many questions among those women and those parents, rather, that are detained on how they're going to end up being reunited with their loved ones anytime soon.
Cal, I'll turn to you lastly here. I mean, you've been down on the border, so has Gabe. Mariana's been there. Craig, all of my colleagues down there on the border trying to find answers, trying to get inside these facilities. I'll point out the images that you've been seeing on your screen are provided by the U.S. government to us. You hear from lawmakers over and over again. They've been trying to get answers. They've had difficulty doing that. I just want to talk a little bit, Cal, here about the blind faith we've had to have here because this government has not been giving us the answers that we wanted.
Yeah, listen, the president has been lying to the public. He's been lying to the media. The heads of the agencies have been lying. We've been lied to by the Border Patrol agents here. I'll give you just one example. We were on a county road, a public road, and we were told it's private property, and we were run off it. That's just one example of trying to get a shot, just even of those tents. I'll give you a better example, actually. Senators who came here yesterday went inside, and they asked the officials, after they took a look at those tents and they took a look at those kids, they asked officials inside, what is the reunification process, and when is it going to happen, and what are the details? And they were told you need to call back in a week, David.
My thanks to Cal Perry down there in Tornillo, Texas. Gabe Gutierrez, who joined us from that detention facility in Los Fresnos. Thanks to you as well. And I'm going to dig into this a little bit more here with John Burnett. He is NPR's Southwest correspondent who covers immigration. Jenna Johnson, who covers the White House for the Washington Post. And Abby Livingston, she is the Washington bureau chief for the Texas Tribune. And John, let me start with you. I'm going to stick with this line of inquiry here about the confusion and the chaos that we've seen here. I'll go back to those numbers that we got from DHS. How do you process what we've gotten from DHS? How do you make sense of what those numbers are, what we've seen?
Well, 4 days after this hastily written executive order, last night at 10:30, we got this statement from Homeland Security and Health and Human Services, and they said, basically, trust us, we're the government. There will be now, going forward, a well-coordinated plan to reunify parents who've been separated from their children. As we know, they said there are about 500 kids who've been reunified so far and a little over 2,000 who have not. The problem with this is the sort of confused, disorganized nature in the past 4 days. One hopes that it's going to improve now. I mean, just for one example, the western and southern districts of Texas, the U.S. Attorney's offices, dropped charges against heads of families late last week, but that didn't mean that those fathers were any closer to getting reunified with their children. Moreover, Customs and Border Protection and the Department of Justice say they're going to continue Trump's zero-tolerance policy. They're going to keep criminally charging everyone that crosses the border illegally, and then they're going to turn them over to ICE's custody, but there's no room. There is no room in the inn. There are 3,300 family detention beds in America. Most of them are in Texas, and 80% of those are full. So there's really no place to put these families if they continue to turn them over to ICE and to use the zero-tolerance policy. So we hope that there is more organization going forward, but it's really been chaotic up to now, David.
Jenna Johnson, I know you got that press release like we all did late last night, and the criticism that we've heard time and time again of this administration is this policy was put in place, this zero-tolerance policy was put in place, and there was no plan for how it might be implemented. And you had that executive order, the same story. There wasn't a plan to see it implemented. What is the White House saying about what happens next? As we look ahead to this week, you get that press release, some indication here the DHS is trying to do more. What's the White House saying about the policy path forward?
Yeah, well, like you're saying, this is yet another example of the White House coming out with a policy and not seeming to really kind of think through how exactly is this going to work. If we take kids away from their parents, how exactly are we going to get those kids back with their parents? You know, and then they see this public backlash. A lot of Americans were very just heartbroken by what they were seeing, these children being separated from their parents. And they clearly were reacting to that in the president very hastily coming out with this executive order. But again, we're facing the same problem that they had with their original policy, in that they just don't seem to be thinking through how the agencies need to actually be implementing this. There is an effort underway to try to reunite children with their parents. You know, but as far as that actually happening, you know, parents are saying they call a 1-800 number, no one answers. They don't know where their kids are. Kids are spread out all over the country. There are kids who were taken from parents, but were not labeled as being taken from a parent. And so there might be an assumption that they're an unaccompanied minor. In just 6 weeks, a real crisis built. And the White House needs to very quickly fix this. And we've seen some efforts towards unwinding this and doing something different. But that doesn't change the fact that there's still this crisis.
Abby Livingston, I want to turn to you and just get your reaction to what we have heard from the president. I'll read a couple of tweets from him from today on this issue. We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. Our system is a mockery to good immigration policy and law and order. Most children come without parents. Our immigration policy, he continues, laughed at all over the world, is very unfair to all those people who have gone through the system legally and are waiting online for years. Immigration must be based on merit. We need people who will help to make America great again. Yesterday, he was out in Nevada, Abby, talking about this issue, saying it's a good issue for Republicans going into the midterm elections. What are the lawmakers you talked to, those from Texas and elsewhere, saying about that issue, about the degree to which the White House is cognizant of how bad this has been for the Republican Party?
I think this raises major concerns within the Republican Party, but only privately. Texas members of Congress are extremely reluctant, or at least from the Republican side, are reluctant to cross the president on this. I do wonder, Texas is headed in a demographic direction toward a majority Hispanic, and this sort of rhetoric could be what drives Hispanics sometimes for the first time to the polls. I very much wonder if they will show up to the midterms this fall.
John Burnett, I want to turn to you again and just get your prescription for what might happen going forward here. We had the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer today calling for a reunification czar, a point person to oversee this project. Again, you have DHS saying maybe it's not bad as we all think it is, saying that they know where all these children are, but it seems like this is a monumental undertaking, a big task. What's your sense of what's going to happen here and if his call is going to fall on deaf ears?
Well, what I think is going to happen is eventually they will get these kids reunified with their parents, although a spokesman with Health and Human Services in the Valley was quoted on, I think on Friday, as saying it could be up to 4 months. I think what's going to happen is that another piece of this is that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, changed the rules on what is a acceptable asylum claim now. And so these families are going to continue to come up, presumably from Central America, with these stories of women who say that they've had domestic abuse, families that say that these drug gangs have been trying to recruit their young sons, threatening to rape their daughters. So they're all coming to ports of entry, crossing the river illegally, and they're going to find out that these are no longer valid claims. And I've already heard from some lawyers who represent some of these women that have made these claims that that's the new wave, is that they're being denied fairly briskly. And there are women who are now under a deportation order, and their children are not with them. So we know that there are reports that some of these Central Americans have been sent back without their children. We don't know if that's going to continue or not.
John, Jenna, and Abby, thank you all very much for the time. John Burnett from NPR, Jenna Johnson, and Abby Livingston, thanks to you as well. And if you missed it, President Trump is calling for the removal of undocumented immigrants without due process, tweeting today, "We cannot allow all these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came." That is something else, and two lawyers are going to join me when we come back to talk about due process. Welcome back. I'm David Gura. President Trump making it loud and clear he wants undocumented immigrants who illegally enter the country to be sent back without due process. This is what he wrote on Twitter, and it is extraordinary. Quote, "We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. Our system is a mockery to good immigration policy and law and order. Most children come without parents. Our immigration policy, laughed at all over the world, is very unfair to all those people who have gone through the system legally and are waiting online for years. Immigration must be based on merit. We need people who will help to make America great again." Some legal perspective on this now from Danny Savalos. He's an MSNBC legal analyst, and Jill Wine-Banks, former Watergate prosecutor, an MSNBC contributor, and I should say she also has years of experience working on immigration law cases. Jill, let me turn to you first. I said this is extraordinary. The president seemingly unaware of asylum, the process of asylum, that people flee their countries to come here for very important and critical reasons. How do you react to what the president is laying out in those tweets this morning?
His tweets are outrageous. It is lawful to come to this country and present yourself for asylum. Those are lawful entrants to this country, and they should be treated with dignity, respect, and be afforded all the due process that our country allows to them. And it's outrageous for him to have said that. It's outrageous for him to think that we should just be deporting people, even if they came illegally without coming here for asylum, without due process. That's what we afford, and the taking children from the families makes it even worse. It compounds the problem.
It showcases, to my mind at least, the president's ignorance about this entire process. Danny Savalas, let me turn to you. You've spent the better part of a week down in Texas, talking to attorneys down there, watching the legal system work at the border. How do you react to what the president said this morning?
Constitutional rights are often inefficient. In other words, to preserve our rights, these very rights make it more difficult to go before a summary court or just ignore the court process altogether. But that inefficiency is what makes our country special, because we have those rights. So while President Trump might want to bypass the due process that is afforded to immigrants just as it is to citizens, he simply cannot likely do so. He can try, but it would likely not be a procedure that would be upheld by a court, because the Supreme Court has for some time held that even illegal aliens, illegal immigrants are entitled to due process protections.
Just going to read a statement here from the American Civil Liberties Union that they tweeted shortly after those tweets came out from the president. What President Trump has suggested here is both illegal and unconstitutional. Any official who has sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws should disavow it unequivocally. Jill, I want to turn back to you and to these numbers that we got from the federal government overnight, indicating that there are 2,053 children who remain in custody. Some of my colleagues who have been reporting on the border, including Jacob Soboroff, have said he's gotten indications that some of these children may be, if not permanently separated from their parents may have been deported at the time of entry. So the children are here, the parents are no longer here, and it raises the question how that might have happened. And I guess one reason could be that they signed papers agreeing to their deportation immediately. Help us understand the legal confusion surrounding this process and the problems therein.
I think the problem really is that the government acted as it often has in terms of the travel ban, for example. They make an announcement without thinking through what are the consequences of it. So they announce a zero tolerance and we're going to deport you without a hearing. And they've been having these mass hearings where in a mass group people are asked, do you agree that you're guilty? That is not how our country works, but that's what, and I think you were correct in saying the president simply doesn't understand the immigration system, just in the same way he doesn't understand our legislative process. And so it's a very bad system. I'm very happy that the American Bar Association, the Texas Bar Association, and many other organizations, including the ACLU, are providing legal representation. The president's now talking about having JAG officers be the ones to prosecute, using his word, these cases. But if he's going to do that, he ought to be having them also defend, because none of these, particularly the children, have defense lawyers.
On that point, Jill, I know that you were the general counsel of the U.S. Army. What do you make of that? Taking JAG officers, taking military lawyers, and sending them down there to do this. When you look at allocation of resources, does that make sense to you, Jill?
Well, first of all, of course, the JAG officers for all the services have full-time jobs. They are busy lawyers. So taking them for this means that they are not going to be representing soldiers and sailors who need their representation. And so that's a problem. They are very skilled and gifted lawyers. I have a high degree of respect for them. They are quick studies because in the military process, they are quickly rotated from one thing to another. So they learn how to learn a new area of law fast. I'm not worried that they won't understand immigration law. I'm worried that they will only be there to hurry people out of the country and that they won't be there to help them stay. And that's a problem for me. We need to have psychologists. If we're going to send, as I said, defense prosecutors, let's send defense lawyers. Let's send some of the psychologists that the military has. Let's help these children to get over the trauma that we are forcing on them by treating them in this way. It is just simply wrong.
Danny, I want to turn to you once again as someone who's been down there talking to lawyers. I raised the specter there that some parents may have signed papers quickly, perhaps under duress, in those early hours after they were apprehended. Are you hearing anything about that from the lawyers that you talked to? What are you hearing about how this process has unfolded again and again and again as these families have come to the United States?
More than hearing, this is what I have personally seen. I have seen in court misdemeanor defendants have their sentencing conducted in a row by a judge, and when permitted to allocute, in other words, when they were allowed to address the court, most of them said nothing at all, but those that did speak expressed an interest in just getting back home as soon as they could. Whatever they needed to say, they would say to get the shortest jail sentence possible so that they could return home to children that they had back in their home country. They didn't speak to whether or not they had any children here in the United States, but the attitude was generally, what do we need to do to get out of here, to move this process along? Whether or not they fully understood the process really is a question. Although they stated under oath that they did, criminal defense attorneys like me often wonder at how much defendants really understand what they're entering into, especially when you have a language barrier.
All right, Danny Cevallos, thank you for your good work down there on the U.S.-Mexico border. Jill Wine-Banks, thanks to you as well. Well, no soup for you. A Virginia restaurant refusing to serve Sarah Huckabee Sanders because of the man she works for. And the White House press secretary, not the only administration official who says the nation's capital has been less than hospitable to young Trumpies. We'll have details after the break.
But these members of his cabinet who remain and try to defend him, they're not going to be able to go to a restaurant. They're not going to be able to stop at a gas station. They're not going to be able to shop at a department store. The people are going to turn on them. They're going to protest. They're going to absolutely harass them until they decide that they're going to tell the president, no, I can't hang with you.
The inimitable Maxine Waters, the California Congresswoman, weighing in on White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders getting kicked out of a Virginia restaurant and tweeting about it. The owner of that restaurant, the Red Hen, tells the Washington Post, quote, "I'm not a huge fan of confrontation. I have a business and I want the business to thrive. This feels like the moment in our democracy when people have to make uncomfortable actions and decisions to uphold their morals." That's the quotation. You saw something different there on the screen. Joining me now is Daniel Lippman. He writes the Political Playbook. Sir Michael Singleton is a Republican strategist. Daniel, you cover the zeitgeist in Washington, D.C. Get us up to speed on what happened here. Lexington is not in the capital area per se, about 5 hours west. Give us a sense of what happened here with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, first of all.
So it's a sea of blue, or it's a tiny dot of blue and a sea of red in Virginia. And so she and her friends and her husband went to the restaurant on Friday night, tried to have dinner, and the chef called the owner and said, Sarah Sanders is in the restaurant. The owner, drove to the restaurant and basically conferred with staff and asked her to leave the restaurant because she felt like they shouldn't endorse her values. And so this is one of a string of other Trump people who've been hassled at restaurants. You saw Stephen Miller at a Mexican restaurant, Kirsten Nielsen a few days ago, as the children of immigrants were in the news, and Nielsen was the architect of that. So this is really pervading D.C. and the Washington area.
Sure, Michael Singleton, weigh in on this. What was your reaction to it? Daniel Lippman bringing up that incident at a Mexican restaurant on 14th Street, socialists shouting down the Secretary of Homeland Security. How do you react to what we've seen here, these protests over these last few days?
Well, look, David, I mean, it's pretty fundamentally basic to me as a conservative. Look, I think that the free marketplace has every right for any private entity to dictate whom they would like to offer service to. And if said individuals don't like it, then they have the right to spend their dollars elsewhere. And the general public, by and large, will dictate with their dollars whether or not they want to agree by spending their money at that particular establishment or disagree by spending their money elsewhere. And then the marketplace will dictate the ultimate outcome of that company, whether they stay open or closed. So I don't think conservatives should complain about this, because it's quite funny to me when you think conservatives would typically argue, well, against the other side, stop complaining about businesses wanting to disservice other individuals by their religious beliefs, etc. But when it happens to us, we're crying foul. I think it's hypocritical. We need to have a standard across the board. I think the marketplace would dictate the outcome of that particular establishment.
Daniel Lippman has written a piece here for Politico magazine about the atmosphere in Washington, Washington, D.C. for those who work for the Trump administration. Before we get into that fully, Shermichael, I want to ask you worked for Dr. Ben Carson, the Secretary of HUD. Was this something that you and he had to deal with? Was it something that you talked about or worried about, the way in which you would be accepted or not in Washington, D.C.?
No, because I, for the most part, have sort of disassociated myself with some of, or a lot of the antics coming from the administration. And even with working with Dr. Carson, I mean, some folks may find this hard to believe, but I didn't always agree with Dr. Carson on some things, and we would have those conversations in private. And at the end of the day, he's the principal, so I would always take heed to the ultimate decision or direction he wanted to go with certain things. But he would always give me the opportunity to sort of voice my opinion on certain things, and maybe if he agreed, he would say, okay, you're raising something that I don't necessarily agree with, I'll consider that. So I have never personally had issues with friends, associates, etc. because of my political leanings. But I think a lot of Republicans are, because you think about a lot of the things that come from the Trump administration. A lot of people associate those things with intolerance, with racism, sexism, misogyny, etc. And so it's very difficult for most rational people to sort of reconcile those things by associating themselves and individuals who work for someone who uphold those types of values.
Daniel Lippman, when you look at the Sarah Huckabee Sanders situation, there are two sides to this story here. You've got her getting kicked out of the restaurant, a lot of people upset about that happening. I should say there are some who are not upset with that happening. The other issue, though, is the ethical one. And you look at Walter Shaub, who is the head of ethics in President Obama's administration. He tweeted out this, saying it was essentially inappropriate that Sarah Huckabee Sanders would use her White House Twitter account, her official government Twitter account, representing herself as a representative of the administration, to criticize this restaurant, to call it out by name, to mention where it is, etc. How strong a case is that? What are folks telling you about the ethical lines she may have crossed?
I think it's one of a number of different cases where you have President Trump and his senior officials calling out specific companies. He has railed on Amazon and Jeff Bezos. You had Kellyanne Conway even talk about how people should buy Ivanka's clothing. And it's this really situation where it is seen as unethical to call out a company when you get a lot of hate mail, a lot of phone calls. That restaurant was closed yesterday after all of this happened. And the red lines are being crossed in this administration often because Sarah Sanders and other officials, they simply don't care if they call out specific businesses because they can get away with it.
I'm going to just go ahead, sure. Michael, yeah, jump
really
in.
Quickly, I was just going to say, at my brief time at HUD, I was in the process of creating a separate Twitter account from my personal Twitter account, and the ethics attorneys in the General Counsel's office were very, very clear on what we could and shouldn't tweet out, and they always said, if you aren't sure about something, don't post it on social media or ask us for clarity. And so I'm really disappointed at the fact that she tweeted that on her official government Twitter account, because the rules are very, very clear. I'm certain you could ask any ethics attorney, and they would probably say that it just wasn't appropriate.
Last question here, Shermichael. I'm going to read a line here from Daniel Lippman's piece. He's quoting a staffer in Washington, D.C. You do the small talk thing and you have a very good conversation, and then they might say, you didn't vote for Trump, right? She says. As soon as I say, of course I did, it just devolves into an all caps, how could you be such a racist and a bigot? I lived in Washington, D.C. for the better part of a decade. It's a place where, if it's not the first question, it's the second question. Where do you work, or who do you work for? Has the response changed? Do you sense a reluctance among those who work for this administration to say that they do work for them in light of what's being described there in Dan Lippman's piece?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have friends who work for the administration, even within the White House, and when we have personal conversations, I just tell them, guys, look, don't tell people who you work for, because it causes unnecessary angst, if you will, when you're having conversations with someone. And you might actually have the potential to establish a good relationship with someone that may end or may cease because of your association with the president. It's not worth it. Presidents come to go. These people will have to have careers beyond Donald Trump. They have to be smart about revealing who they work for.
Dan Lippman, last question to you. How representative was that quotation, what that young woman told you in that piece?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of administration staffers, and they've had trouble dating. They've lost friends. They all live cocooned in a number of apartment buildings in Navy Yard in D.C. And I talked to one White House staffer who gets yelled at regularly when he's leaving work at the White House. And so, it's a place where D.C. voted 96% for Hillary Clinton, and they don't feel very welcome by the Beltway residents who feel like Trump is taking down a lot of norms, and these people represent Donald Trump, and it's kind of a way to get back at Trump, even though they can't reverse the election result.
Daniel Lippman, you see his byline every day when you open up that Politico playbook. Michael Singleton, Republican strategist, thanks to both of you for the time.
Thanks so much, David.
Thank
From
you.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders being kicked out of that restaurant to the movement to have President Trump removed from the White House, Tom Steyer, who's leading the push to get President Trump impeached, joins me live next why he says the crisis at the border bolsters his case. Back, I'm David Gura. At latest count, hundreds of migrant children torn from their parents are still in the custody of the government. With each day they remain separated from their families, public outrage grows and inspires new examples of activism. The hedge fund billionaire Tom Steyer is channeling his outrage into a commercial.
Terrible things happen when you leave a lawless president in power. Donald Trump is unfit for his office. Call Congress now. If they won't stand up to him, they're just as responsible as he is.
Tom Steyer heads up the group Need to Impeach, and he joins me now. Tom, you've heard the criticism. You might be exploiting that audio, using that audio in the ads that you have. Why did you decide to do it? Why did you decide to bring this into your campaign?
Well, David, to be clear, this advertisement was co-funded and co-sponsored by the Latino Victory Fund, and we thought that it was important that Americans actually experience the cruelty and the pain that Mr. Trump is causing, because it's important in knowing that when you have a reckless, dangerous, and lawless president, terrible things will happen. And we wanted people to really feel when terrible things happen what it means for human beings.
Tom, you tweeted this week. Mr. Trump's retreat this week reaffirms that raising our collective voice is how we will defend our democracy and basic human decency. It is up to us. I'm incredibly encouraged by everyone who's already signed the Need to Impeach petition. How did your thinking, how did your approach change over these last 2 weeks as you've seen what's happened down on the U.S.-Mexico border?
Well, to be fair, David, we have been supporting the legal system about immigration and supporting the immigrant rights community for years. What we saw here was a cruel attempt by the president and the administration to use the immigration system to punish asylum seekers, their families, and their children. And we really saw kind of an escalation of the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on asylum seekers that has been part of this administration even before they were elected. That was part of their campaign.
I'm going to read these two astonishing tweets from the president once again. I know you're not a lawyer, but I want you to react to what the president's asserting in them about due process. Quote, "We cannot allow all these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. Our system is a mockery to good immigration policy and law and order. Most children come without parents. Our immigration policy laughed at all over the world. It is very unfair to all those people who have gone through the system legally and are waiting online for years. Immigration must be based on merit. We need people who will help to make America great again." Again, you're not a lawyer, Tom. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read that and see that he is going firmly against the due process that we hold so dear in this country.
Well, of course he is. And I think that that's absolutely consistent with his approach towards everything, which is to ignore the law, to break down and attack American democracy, and to be incredibly insensitive to human rights and civil rights, in this case, including of children. And what we're seeing is almost half of Americans believe that this man should be impeached and removed from office. So it is not me speaking. It's not the Latino Victory Fund alone speaking. I think Americans in general, the American people, are recoiling at this kind of attitude.
I had Congresswoman Maxine Waters on yesterday, and she made the case loud and clear for impeachment. She's been calling for it in Congress. She laid out that case yesterday. What's your message to Democrats as we approach these midterms? How important are those midterms for determining the course that you take policy-wise?
Well, I think that when we talk about impeachment, and I have a ton of respect for Congresswoman Waters, but I think when we talk about impeachment, there are two parts of it. One is the legal criteria for being impeached, which is one part of it, and the other part is the urgency for getting this man out of office. Because the longer that we leave a reckless, dangerous, and lawless president in office, the more things like this we'll see, and the next round of this, David, will be worse.
Tom,
so what we're saying to people running for office is you should be addressing what you're actually going to do to control this president, what you're actually going to do to stand against his policies, not just complain, not just whine. What are you going to do about it?
How sympathetic are you to Democratic lawmakers in particular? I had Congressman Emanuel Cleaver on this morning. We were talking about just how difficult it is without having regular order to make a difference policy-wise on Capitol Hill. Democrats would like to have hearings. They'd like to do more, and they just can't because of the strictures that are in place on Capitol Hill. You say you're keeping tabs on what people are doing and what they aren't doing. How much sympathy do you have for Democrats who say they're just unable to do anything?
Well, I have a ton of sympathy, David, because I know that Republicans control both the Senate and the House, and they control the committees, and they control what is heard, and the kind of oversight of the White House that is absolutely gone by the board. So I'm very sympathetic. So therefore, you have to ask people, what can they do? We're calling on people, Republicans and Democrats, to stand up for the country and the Constitution and the American people. We're asking for patriotism, not partisanship.
Last question here, just your message to some of the graybeards in the Democratic Party. David Axelrod tweeting this out. I returned to that ad that we showed at the top. Billionaire Tom Steyer wasted no time in converting the sound of crying immigrant children into the latest ad for his vanity project / impeachment campaign. That's his characterization there. There are those in the Democratic Party who don't want this to happen. They think that this is a death wish for the Democrats to keep pushing for impeachment. What do you say to them? What do you say to folks like David Axelrod?
We have two rules for thinking about criticism from people inside the Beltway like Mr. Axelrod. And that is, one, are we telling the truth, and is it an important truth? And two, are we standing up for the American democracy and the American people? And if we think we're telling an important truth and standing up for the democracy and the American people, then we're going to go forward, and we're not going to let the elites inside the Beltway tell us that everybody outside of Washington should stand down and they'll take care of it, because frankly, they haven't been taking care of it.
Tom, always good to speak with you. Thank you very much for the time on this Sunday. That's Tom Steyer.
Thanks for having me.
Joining me from California. Drain the swamp, popular rally cry for Donald Trump when he was running for president. Next, we're going to take you to one swamp where locals, many of whom voted for Donald Trump, do not want that swamp to be drained. Welcome back. I'm David Gura. President Trump pledged to drain the swamp in Washington and to champion the forgotten man. But for a group of Louisiana fishermen, their actual swamp and their livelihoods are in danger. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard went down to the largest swamp in the United States, and he met with residents who say they're still waiting for the president and for EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to step in. And Vaughn joins me now. Vaughn, what are they saying? What's their issue? What's the heart of their issue with the President of the United States?
David, first met these gentlemen just a month after Trump's inauguration. I was at a town hall with Republican Senator Bill Cassidy in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. There were a lot of people that stood up about health care, about Russian interference in the election. But then these men stood up, these crawfishermen in the country's largest swamp, and they expressed frustration that they haven't been listened to. We asked them, can you explain to us? And they said, follow us out of the swamp. We did just that then, and then 16 months later, just this week, we returned, and this is what we found.
Oh, that's my baby.
Ben Bienvenu lives off Louisiana waters.
This is my front yard.
Fishing the Chafalaya Basin, America's most expansive swamp. When we first visited in March of last year,
one crawfish.
The swamp was suffering.
Crawfish have to have current to be able to move and survive.
The result, they say, of oil and gas pipelines changing the waters.
You can't sell a dead crawfish.
I learned my schooling in the Chafalaya Basin.
Jody Mesh showed us how decades of development redrew the swamp.
This should be full of water right now.
Right. There should be water flowing across this whole swamp area right here.
Instead, miles of dams created by old pipelines.
Good flowing water makes everything produce. Now we produce probably about maybe 20-30% of what we used to produce.
We returned this week to find the state and federal government issued new permits.
This is the newest pipeline under construction.
Right. Hopefully they're going to pull the dirt back into the excavated trench, and they're not going to leave it like they've done in the past. Every company that we've dealt with in the past, they've never provided any relief.
Last year, they hoped to have a champion in this fight.
Yes, I did vote for Donald Trump.
Believing he would protect the basin.
I think he's bold enough to make the right changes.
A year later, the swamp is still waiting.
You and I met just a month after Trump was inaugurated. You told me that you needed the Trump administration's help. Have you gotten that help yet?
Not yet, no.
The Environmental Protection Agency, absent amid deregulation of oil and gas companies under Scott Pruitt, knee-deep in a different swamp.
Luxury condo.
Pay raises. Special favors. Ritz-Carlton lotion.
What? Soundproof booth.
First-class travel.
The EPA director is supposed to see to it that our environment is taken care of and making sure that we're leaving something for our next generation.
If President Trump and Scott Pruitt are listening, what's your message to them?
Please help us. You know, I pray for you every day. Do the right things for the right reasons. This filter was put here by God to filter the water. It can't filter no more. It's just a big rotten ball of water. And it needs the administration to come and help us.
David, when you go around the country, right, when you talk to the coal miners in West Virginia, you talk to the corn farmers in Iowa, what you constantly hear is that desire for help. That's the reason that they voted for President Trump. I'm often asked, why do these Trump voters around the country stick with the president? Why do they continue to have that hope? And frankly, what you heard from these guys is that they need that help. 20 years ago, David, 3,000 fishermen. Today, just 300. They believed the president in 2016. 16 months in, they're losing a little bit of that hope, but it's still very much there because they are losing where else to turn to. As you heard Ben say, they're now looking to God because that's the point where this is at for them. David?
Vaughn, we've been talking an awful lot about immigration this weekend and last weekend as well, and a theme to that is this disconnect between promises and policy. And it strikes me watching that piece of yours there, that exists here as well. You heard promises from the president, but executing them is more difficult, one would say, or think, than it is to make them. And when it comes here, you look at the conflicting interests, at environmental interests, oil and gas interests. What did they have to say about that, their willingness to be patient with this president?
I think with the case of this president is when you ask them, they genuinely believed that this was a man who would see things for common sense. They are confused, and that's where, in my role as a journalist, you become sympathetic for these figures like these craw fishermen that you meet there because they had that hope and they instilled. And I said, look, why is Scott Pruitt, a man that represented oil and gas companies when he was Attorney General of Oklahoma? And to me, they say, well, the president hasn't been down here. And once Scott Pruitt actually see this for themselves, then they'll understand. And you hear that from corn farmers. You hear that from those coal miners. Once you see it, then you'll understand it. But the issue is, well, we watch the president tweet on a daily basis, and the president is not out there. The president is not there on a daily basis. You see this with a lot of the politicians, though. They've been begging their state lawmakers, their senators, their congressional members to come out for them. From the local level, the state level, the federal level, oftentimes these people feel like they are not heard, and quite frankly, they aren't heard, or else there would be legitimate action taken. David?
And Vaughn, what did they say about patience? How patient are they going to be with this president? A number of them supported President Trump during the last election. Is that support waning?
Mm-hmm. I asked them, I said, what would it take for you to vote a Democrat? And several of them mentioned to me that they used to be Democrats. They used to be these Southern Democrats. And I said, well, what is it going to take now? They're going to say, somebody needs to come and see and listen to us. Because so far, we feel like we haven't been listened. So, when are we going to see a Democrat rolling through rural Louisiana, David? I'm not sure. But it's a message the Democratic Party should perhaps take note of to get outside of Iowa, get outside of New Hampshire. These are states that are unlikely, sure, in the general election to change the tone. But at this point in time, when you go into places like rural Mississippi, rural Alabama, right, they feel like the Democratic Party hasn't been listening to them. And quite frankly, you haven't seen many of them actually out there.
Before I go, did you have any crawfish? Did you have a boil while you were down there?
They took good care of us.
Very
I can
good.
tell you that.
Vaughn Hillier, my colleague, joining me today from Las Vegas. He's on the road talking to good folk across this great country. Up next, we'll head back to the border where protesters are once again demanding a change to the Trump administration's tough immigration policies. Policies President Trump himself is defending today on Twitter. Much more straight ahead.